This is an extract from the Leader Coronavirus Daily podcast by the Evening Standard and hosted by me, David Marsland. To hear the whole thing, search for it on your podcast provider. With dogs in cages, exotic birds strung up by their legs, rare animals for sale as food or medicine, the world's wet markets can be grim places to look around. What you don't see is the massive amount of money being made and the organised gangs operating behind the scenes. The consequences of these places, though, are visible to all. We cannot say for sure that COVID-19 came from a wet market in Wuhan, but it's at the very top of a very short list of suspects. Now, the Evening Standard and Independent are partnering with conservation group Space for Giants to campaign for the trade to end. Their CEO, Max Graham, joins me now from their HQ in Kenya. Max, regardless of where COVID-19 came from, we know that wet markets have been the source of previous viruses.
I mean, the first thing to say is that we've got to be quite careful about the terminology, wet market. I think we all know what we think we mean, but a wet market is literally just a place that people go to get their fresh produce. So I think what we're talking about are situations in which wild animals are traded, slaughtered for meat in close proximity to people. And we know that, the proximity of wild animals to people can increase the risk of zoonotic diseases. There have been many before this. There have been warnings about this potential risk. Experts out there, epidemiologists, are not surprised of the emergence of deadly disease. In fact, they've been warning experts, political leaders about this for a long time. I think what's perhaps shocked all of us is just how quickly that disease spread and how it's caused literally the end of the way we live as we used to know it.
But as you've said, they've been around for a long time. There's been acknowledgement of the risk of diseases coming from them. But up to this point, it seems that it's been impossible to stop these markets from continuing. Has that changed? Is there a will now to do more?
I think that from the ashes of this crisis, we're going to see an enormous amount of political will behind preventing the next pandemic. The supply of wildlife, particularly that wildlife that presents the greatest risk to people, has been an issue for a long time. The illegal wildlife trade has been very hard to stop. It's the fourth biggest illegal trade in the world. It ranks up there with the illegal arms, human trafficking, and drugs. So it's a source of money for very powerful and dangerous criminals. Now, I think one of the challenges we face is that wildlife is also a source of protein for tens of millions of people globally. So it's not sufficient just to say, end all wildlife trade. We have to be quite surgical in the interventions that are required to ensure that the conditions in which species that are traded can present a risk to human health are targeted. It's not just about closing down markets. It's actually about stopping the demand and stopping the supply of wildlife. We're very focused on the supply side of the illegal wildlife trade. We invest in security through our partners on the ground so that rangers can protect wildlife, and we invest in prosecution capacity so that illegal wildlife criminals can be convicted. And then we support initiatives like this, global campaigns that bring awareness and political will behind ending demand for trade and ending the conditions that could allow for animals to be slaughtered or traded in close proximity to urban populations.
So what will it take, Max, to end this? What sort of things what are the difficulties that you see when you're working on the ground, when you're trying to combat, as you've said, an industry that is worth an extremely large amount of money and there will be a huge amount of resistance?
There are three ways to tackle this, and we'll start from the top. The first is we have to see new international binding commitments from political leaders to a convention that tackles surgically the trade in wildlife and the emergence of conditions that can lead to deadly diseases transferring from a wild animal or a domestic animal into a person. And it's got to be carefully drawn up with the best advice possible, and then it has to be ratified by the big global powers. And I think it's a huge opportunity for the UK to work hand in hand with China, obviously other nations, but China and the UK have a real opportunity to work together on this. Second, we need the regulations that are outlined in that convention to be nationalized. So it's all very well having new regulations, but unless you invest in prosecution capacity on the ground, the ability of national judicial systems to actually enforce laws, unless you invest in that capacity, a convention will go nowhere. So you've got to combine it with that. The third element is really around how do we ensure that wildlife, natural habitat is valuable so that it is protected, so we don't get the situation where we get habitats fragmented, where we get wildlife being captured and traded to supply the illegal wildlife trade. And that really requires investment in wildlife economies, in the protection of natural habitat. It seems a far cry now, but wildlife tourism, ecotourism was the backbone of many protected areas' annual budgets. There has to be something else that covers the cost of protection now. And I expect ecosystem climate change, carbon emission offsets could be a big player in protecting our collective health going forward by ensuring that those natural ecosystems where wildlife come from are effectively protected. So I think that we're all linked and tied up to this issue now. And I think the readers of the Eating Standard could do a huge amount to both contribute financially to efforts to stop this trade, and also to work collectively to encouraging the British government to stand side by side with other nations to get behind a responsible and binding commitment so that this never happens again. We've got to prevent the next pandemic.
Search for the Leader Coronavirus Daily on any podcast provider to hear more from the podcast.